In a stunning move, Germany ends a decades-old all deal with the US and signs with Canada instead.
Brazil and Mexico are turning north not to Washington, but to Ottawa for their next
Another major oil contract slips through Washington's fingers as Canada signs a new multi-year deal with South Korea. In 2025, something strange began happening behind the scenes of the global energy market. Not with explosions, not with embargoes, but with quiet exits. One by one, U.S. oil partners started pulling back. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Brazil, Mexico, Egypt. Then came South Korea and India. By the time Germany followed, it wasn't a trend, it was a stampede. What happened? Why is Canada, the quieter, colder, and smaller neighbor, suddenly becoming the preferred energy partner? And more importantly, if countries like Thailand or Turkey are shifting now, what's waiting at the end of this list? Because the 8th country in this episode might just change everything. Number 1. Brazil. It didn't begin with an announcement. There were no flags lowered, no speeches made. Just one day in February 2025, Brazil's state-owned oil company Petrobras quietly ended its U.S. supply contract 2 years early. The reason? Volatility. Over the past decade, Brazil has relied heavily on U.S. crude to supplement its refining capacity. American shale oil helped stabilize Brazil's urban fuel markets from Rio's public transport fleet to São Paulo's industrial corridors. But recent months brought wave after wave of disruptions. Washington's regulatory shifts, internal pipeline bottlenecks, and, most importantly, the unpredictable swing of American foreign policy. So Brazil pivoted, and it didn't go to Saudi Arabia. It turned to Canada, specifically to Alberta's heavy crude, which, although thicker and slower to process, came with something the U.S. could no longer guarantee: long-term stability. The deal was signed in private, but its impact? Tremendous. Petrobras committed to importing 230,000 barrels per day of Canadian crude by Q3 2025. This move not only diversified Brazil's fuel sources, but sent a clear message to Washington: we can no longer afford to depend on chaos. Canadian officials didn't gloat. They didn't even hold a press conference. They just delivered on time, without drama, and with full compliance to Brazil's new environmental and transparency standards. And just like that, Canada gained a strategic foothold in Latin America's biggest oil market. This wasn't a one-off trade. It was a signal, a quiet but irreversible shift. Number 2. Mexico. For over 5 decades, Pemex, Mexico's state-run oil giant, was deeply tied to the U.S. Gulf Coast. Refined fuels, pipeline networks, and joint ventures defined the cross-border relationship. It wasn't just energy cooperation. It was tradition. But in May 2025, that tradition snapped. After months of growing frustration with American pricing structures, pipeline tariffs, and export delays, Pemex executives made a quiet but stunning move. They signed a $6.2 billion multi-year crude import contract with Canada. Why? Because when Pemex needed reliability, the U.S. offered politics. When they requested capacity expansions, the U.S. offered restrictions. And when Mexico's domestic production declined in early 2025, the U.S. raised prices. Canada, by contrast, offered predictability. And with the completion of the Trans Mountain Expansion project, Canada had something new: direct access to Pacific shipping lanes. That meant Canadian crude could now reach Mexico's western ports faster and cheaper than U.S. oil moving through outdated pipelines from Texas. In the city of Tuxpan, where Pemex's largest import terminal operates, Canadian ships began docking by June. And on the southern border, truckloads of Canadian diesel started flowing into Chiapas and Tabasco regions once dominated by American refineries. The U.S.-Mexico energy partnership had been one of the most stable in North America. But now, we are diversifying, not retreating, said Pemex's new CEO. But we will no longer be dependent on one partner alone. In diplomatic circles, it was a gentle rebuke. In Washington, it was viewed as a betrayal. But in Mexico City, it was seen as smart business. And Canada? They didn't celebrate. They simply showed up, on time, with fuel. Number 3. Egypt. The Suez Canal is one of the most strategic shipping routes in the world. But what few realize is that Egypt isn't just a corridor, it's a consumer. A big one. In 2024, Egypt was importing more than 150,000 barrels per day of refined oil products, with the US being one of its top 3 suppliers. But by early 2025, something shifted. Egypt's economy, already under pressure from currency devaluation and food inflation, began to feel the weight of fluctuating American oil prices. And when Washington reimposed sanctions on multiple trade routes, insurance and logistics costs for U.S. shipments through the Mediterranean skyrocketed. Canada, on the other hand, offered a simple pitch. We'll ship directly through the Red Sea at a locked rate with no surprises. And that's exactly what Egypt needed. Predictability. In March 2025, the Egyptian government signed an energy transition agreement with Canada. It included joint investment in refining infrastructure, stable crude imports from Alberta, and even Canadian-backed port upgrades in Ain Sokhna. The first shipment arrived 6 weeks later, quicker than expected, fully compliant, and $3.70 cheaper per barrel than the U.S. equivalent. Suddenly, Canada wasn't just a supplier. It became a strategic energy partner in the Arab world's most populous nation. For the U.S., this wasn't just a lost contract. It was a signal that its presence in the Middle East energy loop was no longer guaranteed. And for Egypt, it was a turning point. We don't need lectures. We need partnerships, said an Egyptian energy minister in a closed-door briefing. Canada listened and delivered. Number 4. Thailand. For years, Thailand's energy imports were shaped by one rule: diversify but don't provoke. That meant balancing its oil needs between the U.S., Middle Eastern giants, and regional partners like China. But in late 2024, that balancing act collapsed right when Thailand needed stability the most. A devastating flood season wiped out key rail infrastructure, forcing Bangkok to ramp up emergency fuel reserves. But when Thai authorities requested expedited oil deliveries from American suppliers, they were met with red tape, delays, and price surges. By contrast, Canada responded in 48 hours. In December 2024, Thai oil firm PTT struck a deal with Canadian producers to supply emergency crude shipments through Lam Shabang port. But that temporary deal became something else. By February 2025, Canada had inked a long-term $4.1 billion energy partnership with Thailand. It included not just crude oil, but also low-emission aviation fuel, petrochemical feedstock, and technical cooperation on biofuel expansion. Why was Thailand willing to pivot so sharply? Because Canada offered something the U.S. didn't: speed, transparency, and zero geopolitical baggage. And in Asia, where neutrality is survival, that's priceless. We didn't turn away from the U.S., said one Thai official. We turned toward reliability. Ever. In Washington, the shift caught officials off guard. Thailand had never publicly criticized U.S. energy policy. They simply stopped buying. Meanwhile, Canadian shipments through the South China Sea increased six-fold in the first half of 2025. Quiet, strategic, effective. That's how Canada replaced a century-old supplier in just 90 days. Number 5. South Korea. This was the move no one saw coming. For decades, South Korea maintained one of the tightest energy alignments with the United States. Its massive refineries in Ulsan and Yeosu processed American crude, and its defense relationship guaranteed priority supply even in times of crisis. But in March 2025, Seoul quietly declined a renewal of a $2.7 billion annual oil import contract with the U.S. No press conference. No formal announcement. Just silence. When the press finally noticed, the response from South Korea's Ministry of Trade was brief. We have chosen a diversified approach based on future resilience. Translation: they'd gone with Canada. Behind the scenes, it had been in the works for months. Starting in late 2024, Canadian energy companies began courting Korean buyers with a proposition the U.S. couldn't match: long-term price guarantees, emissions reduction incentives, and shared R&D for hydrogen and ammonia transport. Korea, aiming to become Asia's clean energy hub, found this irresistible. In January 2025, Canadian PM Justin Trudeau met with Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol. A week later, Canadian crude began arriving at Busan, alongside collaborative talks for green shipping corridors in the Pacific. American oil executives were stunned, not just by the deal, but by how quietly it was executed. "They didn't even call us to renegotiate," said one former U.S. diplomat. "It was like we were written off." And as seeps of ruddy, South Korea had simply moved on. And for Canada, this wasn't just a win in trade. It was a symbolic victory in a region where loyalty had always leaned red, white, and blue. Until now. Number 6. Turkey. For years, Turkey sat on the geopolitical fence, sometimes leaning east, sometimes west, but always keeping its energy routes open. It was the bridge between Europe and Asia, a NATO member, but also a customer of Russian gas, Iranian oil, and Chinese investment. And yet, in early 2025, Ankara made a surprising pivot. It signed a multi-phase energy deal with Canada, valued at over $3.3 billion. The agreement includes Canadian light sweet crude for Turkish refineries, joint development of underground gas storage near Lake Tuz, and tech sharing on carbon capture from oil-burning plants. So why Canada? Why now? The answer lies in pressure. Washington had recently tightened export conditions to Turkey over unresolved diplomatic tensions and arms procurement disputes. Suddenly, Turkish oil shipments were delayed. Paperwork increased. Worse, Turkish firms found themselves navigating a maze of secondary sanctions on U.S.-sourced fuels. Canada? No drama, no lectures, just delivery. In February 2025, the first shipment of Canadian oil arrived in Mersin. By April, half of Turkey's import quota, once allocated to the U.S., had been rerouted to Canadian partners. Even more striking, Canada offered Ankara something deeply valued: neutral energy security. No political strings, no military conditions. And for a country long used to being told what it shouldn't do, Canada simply asked, "What do you need?" That simple question reshaped the map. In Washington, officials were still analyzing satellite data before they realized what had happened. Turkey had defected from the U.S. energy axis without ever raising a flag. Number 7. Germany. The domino that made Washington panic. When Germany changes course, Europe listens. And in June 2025, Berlin quietly terminated one of the largest long-term U.S. oil import contracts on the continent, worth $6.2 billion annually. This wasn't just a policy tweak. It was a strategic withdrawal. For nearly 2 decades, Germany relied heavily on American oil imports, especially after distancing itself from Russian pipelines post-2022. Washington filled that void until now. So what changed? It began with a confidential report from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs. The document cited volatility in U.S. foreign energy policy, lack of climate alignment, and logistical uncertainty due to U.S. port backlogs and strikes. The seas, Canada, by contrast, offered direct shipment to Northern Europe via new Arctic-capable tankers, oil certified under net zero extraction programs, and a stable, depoliticized trade structure. In April, a high-level delegation from Berlin visited Calgary and Vancouver. They met with Canadian energy CEOs, climate engineers, and even Indigenous leaders overseeing sustainable extraction zones in Alberta. A month later, German media leaked the first shipment manifest: Canadian crude bound for Hamburg. The public reaction? Muted. But inside American diplomatic circles, it was thunderous. When Germany shifts energy partners, it isn't just economic, it's philosophical, said one former State Department advisor. It signals who they believe has the future. Canada had done what no one thought possible: replace the U.S. as Germany's energy fallback. And it didn't require a dramatic speech, just quiet, competent reliability. Germany's exit is more than a headline. It's a signal to all of Europe. The U.S. is no longer the automatic partner. There are alternatives now, and they're working. 8 countries: 8 different paths, but they all led to one conclusion. The U.S. can no longer count on oil loyalty. What started as isolated trade reviews became a quiet rebellion. A rebellion not against America, but for consistency, trust, and long-term reliability, the very things Canada offered. This isn't just a shift in barrels or shipping lanes. It's a geopolitical oil quake. Because if Germany walks, others in Europe might follow. And when that happens, the balance of power in global energy might never be the same again. Subscribe now, because the next country may already be packing its last barrel.